Så där, då var vi igång efter lite tekniska problem. Jag kommer ta det här på engelska också sen så att alla inkluderas. Jag heter Ellen, jag sitter i styrelsen för RFSL Luleå norra Norrbottens län och är här för att presentera föreläsarna ikväll. Förra föreläsningen hade ju lite frågor om intersex så det blir jättespännande nu när Naftali står på scen och ska prata om intersex. My name is Ellen. I'm a board member of RFSL Luleå and norra Norrbottens län. I'm here to present the lectures for tonight. Tonight we have Naftali, who's going to speak about intersex. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello and welcome everyone to my lecture. I hope you've all been having a great time at Luleå Pride. My name is Naftali Ben Tziyon, and I'm a part of OII Sverige, which is a Sweden-based intersex advocacy group. And I'm here today to take you on an odyssey to explore everything intersex. The journey will be divided into 3 main parts. First, we'll start with the basics. Just what does it even mean to be intersex? What's it like? I'll give you a brief 101 and a bit of my own personal experience. You've all probably heard the saying that to understand the present, you must also understand the past. A tree without roots falls, for it has nothing to stand upon. And so in my opinion, a true understanding of the current reality for intersex people and the capacity for change also needs to be rooted and illuminated by the historical realities. So for the second part, we'll take a voyage back through time to look at how intersex individuals have been historically viewed across the world and how intersex bodies became stigmatized and pathologized in our modern society as medical problems in need of correction. And lastly, for the first part, we'll be sticking to the present day and exploring contemporary issues facing intersex people. So let's get started. Part 1, an Intersex 101. If your schooling experience was anything like mine, then when learning about human biology, you were probably presented with a simple binary truth, that there are 2 distinct biological sexes, male and female. But this isn't so much of a truth, and the reality isn't quite so binary. Sure, most people can fit into the groupings of sex characteristics we have medically defined as male or female, but for some of us, it isn't that simple. And there's more of us than you'd think. Around 1.7% of the population are what we call intersex and don't fit neatly into these boxes. That's about the same percentage of people with red hair or with green eyes. For comparison, identical twins make up about 0.3 to 0.4% of births. That's statistically quite a bit rarer than intersex people, but pretty much everyone has, at least at one point in their lives, met an identical twin, and probably many more people you didn't know were an identical twin. You've probably also met several intersex people in your life without realizing it. 1.7% is actually quite a lot of people. Intersex people are any individuals born with sex characteristics, including chromosome patterns, gonads, genitals, and hormone expression, that do not fit binary ideas of male or female bodies. Now, to really understand what intersex variations are and what makes people intersex, we have to dig deeper and first explore some fundamental questions. Sex is something that pervades every part of society and has far-reaching influence on our lives. But what even is it? Just how is it determined? For those of you for whom biology makes you want to fall asleep, I'll try to keep it short and simple. So whilst the chromosomal sex of the embryo is established at fertilization, when the sperm meets the egg, the sex differentiation doesn't actually start until about 6 weeks. Initially, everyone has what we call bipotential gonads, which means that they can develop into either egg-producing ovaries or sperm-producing testes. In a series of events, the initially sex-neutral gonads and genitalia, they progressively acquire male or female characteristics. This relies on a complicated network of genes who, based on their different expression, they either activate the testes pathway and repress the ovarian pathway or vice versa. Initially, everyone's internal genitalia consists of two ducts, which are like tube-like structures that develop later into genitalia. You have, on one hand, the Wolffian duct, which becomes male genitalia, and then you have the Mullerian duct, which becomes female genitalia. And as development proceeds, one of these pairs of ducts develops while the other regresses, and this depends on the presence or absence of a region of the Y chromosome called the SRY gene. And in the presence of it, a hormone called anti-Mullerian hormone, which, like its name suggests, causes a Mullerian duct to regress, and testosterone is produced, which causes the other duct, the Wolffian duct, to develop into male genitalia. And it's vice versa in the other case. So this is how it usually is. As you probably noticed, just from that, there are a lot of different factors at work in sex differentiation. And there's even more than that I didn't mention. It gets a lot more complicated. But so that brings us to our next question. Just what determines your sex? How is biological sex as we know it even defined? You probably remember being taught in school that a male has XY chromosomes and that a female has XX chromosomes. But like with most things, it's not that simple. Sex is not a simple male-female binary based on chromosomes, but rather it's more a set of different factors that we have grouped into two categories, of which chromosomes are just one factor. For most people, all these factors will line up perfectly into one of these two categories we've created. Most people will have XY chromosomes, the SRY gene, testes, testosterone, a penis, etc., or they will have XX chromosomes, no SRY gene, ovaries, estrogen, a vagina, uterus, etc. But then that brings us to the question, what happens if you have some traits from one of these columns, but then some from the other column? Well, then that would make you intersex. There's too many intersex conditions to cover today. The list is almost endless. You can go look it up. But for the sake of illustration, I'll cover just a few. One of the most common ones is called androgen insensitivity syndrome, which is where a person chromosomally is 46XY, but their cells are partially or completely unable to respond to androgen, such as testosterone, which leads to phenotypically female development. So in such a case, if a person's cells are completely unavailable to respond, they will externally or phenotypically look completely female. Or in milder cases, might be a bit ambiguous in between both. The next one that we have is congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is characterized by impaired cortisol, that's the stress hormone, for those of you who have heard of it, in the adrenal cortex. And the most common type is called 21-hydroxylase deficiency, which is where you have reduced synthesis of the stress hormone, which causes increased androgens, such as mainly testosterone, production, and so it causes masculization. And another common example is 47XXY, or as you may know of it, Klinefelter syndrome, where a person has an extra copy of the X chromosome, and this often has very subtle symptoms. A person can go their entire lives without even realizing they have it, and it's usually only noticed at puberty, with features such as breast development, infertility, or small testicles. But there's very, very many more. The prevalence of different intersex conditions, especially those that are genetic and hereditary, it varies greatly from population to population. For example, non-classic congenital adrenal hyperplasia, it's about 1 to 100 to 1 to 200 amongst Europeans, but amongst Ashkenazi Jews, it is 1 in 27, and also 1 in 30 among Sephardi Jews. And for another example, in the US, the prevalence of the classic congenital adrenal hyperplasia, it's about 1 in 15,000 amongst white Americans, but 1 in 280 amongst indigenous American populations. So the frequency of a lot of these varies quite a bit around the world. A brief note on terminology before we continue. Historically, intersex conditions were referred to as hermaphroditism or pseudo-hermaphroditism, and this term is still somewhat in use in the medical world. I studied biomedicine, and that was the term my professors and textbooks used, for example. Current medical nomenclature, though, prefers to call intersex conditions disorders of sex development, but this is quite a controversial term amongst the intersex community because many of us don't see being intersex as being inherently disordered. And then lastly, another term you probably see, endosex, which is someone who is not intersex, so a person who has like typical male or female sex characteristics. It's basically just like how you have transgender and cisgender, you have intersex and endosex. For this lecture, I will be using hermaphroditism and its historical context, but today it's generally seen as a bit outdated and somewhat pejorative term, so it's probably best to avoid it if you're referring to intersex people today, unless the person personally prefers it. So a bit about myself. I come from the small country of Aotearoa, New Zealand, which you all probably have heard of due to a certain very famous movie trilogy. I'll give you a hint, it's about hobbits. I actually lived an hour from Hobbiton, fun fact. And so within New Zealand, the iwi, or a tribe, I guess, that I descend from is Ngaiterangi, and I also grew up in their traditional area, which you can see on the map in the red. The town I'm from is called Te Puke, and if anyone has ever heard of it here, I'll be extremely impressed because it has only 7,000 people, and according to Google Images, the only remotely notable thing about it is a statue of a kiwi fruit. So, yeah, not the most notable place. So here's an embarrassing picture of my teenage self when I tried to dye my hair copper orange. Didn't turn out so well. And now, so I've always been something of a name collector. At this point, I've gone by so many different names that I've lost count. I was originally assigned female at birth, and so given a feminine name, but a name that was completely at odds with how I saw myself. I was not female, I would insist, and even as early as kindergarten, I rebuffed my given name, instead going by masculine or neutral nicknames. My parents, of course, they just wrote it off as me being a tomboy. I'd grow out of it, they said, but I didn't. I told my parents that I was an androgynous boy, and I wore boys' clothes and spent my days pretending to be ninjas from, you've probably heard of anime Naruto, before the other kids in the street. It was what was very popular when I was a kid. And although it wasn't disapproved of, my divergence was somewhat tolerated. I was takatapue, which is what we call anyone who is gender non-conforming or has like a different sexual orientation. It's a bit like the term LGBTIQ+. But all of that changed once I reached puberty at the age of 12, when I found out that I had congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Suddenly, I was developing in very confusing to me ways. I had some breast growth, but also body hair, facial hair, and a more masculinized body shape. I was very confused. I felt like a freak, and I tried to hide my condition from everyone else, including my family, which obviously didn't prove successful. I was already othered at school, being of a mixed ethnic background and the only Jew in the entire region, but now I was othered in another way as well. I was inhabiting the borderlines. I was too masculinized to be seen as a girl, but still not masculine enough to be seen as a boy either. I began living a double life. Outside of school, I lived as male, and generally passed as such too. Even though I loved being active and outdoors, I began skipping PE class to avoid the embarrassment and shame of the dreaded locker rooms. I hated high school with a passion, but for me the tipping point was a wonderful human being, an umbrella collector called Hine Aroha, who decided to go from stealing my umbrellas, to which this day I have no reason what she was even planning on doing with so many, but then one day she decided, she'd had enough of umbrellas, and so she beat me up and smashed my phone. The school, of course, turned a blind eye to this and did nothing. And so I ended up leaving school at the age of 16 and moving as far away as I could from my hometown to Sweden, which is literally, I think I checked, and it's literally the other side of the world, so I think I succeeded on that one. But sadly, my experience is a fairly common one among intersex people. But surely it hasn't always been like this. Just how did we get here? That brings us to part 2, intersex throughout the ages. The term intersex itself may be modern, but people with variant sex characteristics have existed for as long as humans have. Many of our oldest stories and civilizations were aware of and acknowledge that sex isn't binary. What is probably the oldest written account of intersex people comes from an ancient Sumerian myth over 4,000 years old. Enki, a god of water, creation, and knowledge, is tasked by his mother Nama with creating the first humans. His consort Ninma, a mother goddess associated with mountains and fertility, helps him with his task along with her 7 servants or birth goddesses. After their success, Enki holds a feast for his mother Nama and for Ninma, and him and Ninma drink wine, and as often happens when people are intoxicated, they end up placing a bet between each other. Ninma tells Enki that she can determine that a person can have a good or bad body, and she boasts to him that she can determine a person's fate, good or bad, based on her own will. Enki, he counters that he can counterbalance whatever fate, good or bad, she decides, and that he will find a place in society for all people, regardless of their bodily form. Ninma creates 7 humans with atypical biology, and Enki, true to his word, finds places in society for each of them. The 5th human created by Ninma is an intersex woman unable to give birth, whom Enki decrees her fate as a weaver in the queen's household, which at the time was quite a high status position. And then the 6th human created was also intersex, called a Nibru, which is someone with neither a penis nor a vagina, whose fate Enki declares is to stand before the king. So we can see from this that being intersex was quite acceptance. It was, intersex people had quite a lot of social mobility. They could have high status positions, and it was rather accepted within the Sumerian world. And so let's move on to another Middle Eastern civilization, and this is one you've all probably heard of this time, the Jews. So, in Jewish law and tradition, there are in fact 6 different sexes rather than 2. You have Zachar, which is typical male, Nekeva, typical female, androgynous, a person who has both male and female sexual characteristics, Tumtum, a person whose sexual characteristics are determinate or obscured, and Elonit, a woman who does not develop at puberty and is infertile. And then you have Saris, which is a man who doesn't develop at puberty and or subsequently has their sexual organs removed. One story you've probably all heard of is that of Adam and Eve. But in the Jewish tradition, the rabbinical tradition, you'll find a slightly different version of the story than that you are used to. In the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, there are 2 relevant verses about the creation of the first humans. The first is Genesis 1:27, and God created humankind in the divine image, creating it in the image of God, creating them male and female. And the second is Genesis 5:2. Male and female, they were created, and when they were created, God blessed them and called them Adam. The ancient rabbis understood this to mean that the first human was in fact actually an intersex person, with both male and female sex characteristics. Midrashim are basically ancient Jewish biblical commentaries and explanations attached to the scripture based on the oral tradition. In a passage from the famous Midrash, Bereshit Rabbah, Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Eliezer said that in the hour when the Holy One created the first human, he created him androgynous. As it is said, male and female he created them, with them being singular. Abraham and Sarah, who you may have also heard of, are also prominent intersex biblical figures and are said in the Talmud to have been tumtum. So as you can see, there's actually a lot more intersex recognition the biblical era than one would think. And this brings us to the Greeks and the Romans. who had quite an influential role in getting us to the point we are today in our Western civilization. Now, the Greeks and the Romans had one rather popular god called Hermaphroditus, which you may recognize the name because that is where the term hermaphrodite stems from. And as we can see from this quote by a Greek historian, Hermaphroditus, as he has been called, who was born of Hermes and Aphrodite and received a name which is a combination of both of his parents. Some say that this Hermaphroditus is a god and appears at certain times among men, and that he is born with a physical body which is a combination of that of a man and that of a woman, and that he has a body which is beautiful and delicate like that of a woman, and has the masculine quality and vigor of a man. But there are some who declare that such creatures of two sexes are monstrosities, and coming really into the world as they do, they have the quality of presaging the future, sometimes for evil and sometimes for good. Now, the Roman view of sex was a very binary one, and they held a very clear demarcation between male and between female. According to Roman law, all had to be classified as either male or female. And to the Romans, intersex people represented a violation of natural law and of the boundaries as fundamental to Roman life as male and female. In ancient Rome, the birth of an intersex child was considered a prodigium, a disturbance in the natural order, and of a pax deorum, which was the harmony between the divine and the human. A prodigium signaled divine displeasure and had to be expiated to avoid the anger of the gods. As such, intersex babies were killed shortly after birth with an expiation ceremony to appease the gods. So it may seem a little bit paradoxical that depictions of Hermaphroditus were so popular amongst the Romans. But social attitudes towards intersex people did change over time. And by the 1st century, they were viewed with fascination and as sexual novelties rather than with fear. In what has been since interpreted as a case of partial androgen insensitivity, Phlegon of Tralles recorded how a patrician girl on her wedding day began to experience incapacitating stomach pains and within days had physically transformed into a man. This case was brought to the Emperor Claudius's attention, and he celebrated the rebirth, honoring the god's intervention with an altar. So as you can see, just within the span of a couple of hundred years, you had a pretty clear change in how intersex people were viewed within society in ancient Rome. The Greeks, however, had two competing models. You had the Hippocratic model, which viewed sex as a spectrum that encompassed masculine men, feminine women, many shades in between, including hermaphrodites, a perfect balance of the male and female. This theory was popularized during the Roman Empire by the famous physician Galen, and later continued to be a popular theory for much of the Middle Ages. The Aristotelian model, on the other hand, viewed sex as a discrete male-female binary where hermaphrodites were not an intermediate sex but a case of doubled or superfluous genitals. This view later influenced Thomas Aquinas, who was one of the most influential theologians and philosophers of the Middle Ages. Some early Christian writers, adopting Jewish ideas, thought of Adam as an angelic androgynous being, an ancient prototype of humanity that reflected God's purity and simplicity at the beginning of time, and transcended the need for bodily distinctions. Church fathers such as Origen of Alexandria, Gregory of Nyssa, and John Damascene, among others, thought that, in fact, the most elevated state of humanity was the absence of binary sex. Others, however, such as Augustine of Hippo, who ended up being perhaps the most influential figure in the development of Western Christianity, disagreed. Augustine did not see sexuality as being at odds with the original innocence of Eden, and because of this believed that humans must have been created in two distinct sexes, despite, he says, as happens in some births in the case of what we call androgynes. In the end, Augustine's opinion won out, and many subsequent commentators adopted his interpretation. By the 13th century, for the Church, hermaphroditism was for the most part not an immortal ideal, but rather seen as an unfortunate and transitory state that, like other physical defects, reflected the broken nature of this world. The standard for the medieval period, continuing into the early modern period, was for intersex people to be classified as either male or female according to which sex they most appeared like. The individual had some degree of choice, however, as we can see from the guidelines published in 1741 by English physician James Parsons, that a male or female sex shall be chosen according to the predominancy of sex which ought to be regarded, but if the sexes seem equal, the choice is left to the hermaphrodite. But this recommendation was already being eroded by the 19th century, as many doctors used their authority to remedy any ambiguity, and by the late 19th century to promote heterosexuality especially, by choosing a person's sex for them even if it was against that person's own wishes. By the early 20th century, intersex people's bodies had become increasingly medicalized, with the prevailing theory of sex development at the time being that each fertilized egg developed into either sex, but had a predominating tendency towards masculinity or femininity that would cause one set of sex organs to develop and the other to atrophy. This theory held that ultimately every person developed a pair of gonads, either ovaries or testes, that determined their true sex, and thus that an intersex person's true sex could be revealed via their gonads. When genital reconstructive surgery was pioneered between 1930 and 1960 by urologist Hugh Hampton Young and other surgeons at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, the gonadal standard was still king. But the ability to determine even the type of gonads during infancy was still very limited. So sex assignment was determined mainly by the appearance of the external genitalia. And genital reconstructive surgery at the time was primarily performed on older children and adults. In the early 1950s, it was still quite basic. It consisted primarily of ability to remove an unwanted gonad, to bring a testes into a scrotum, to change the position of the urethra, to widen a vaginal opening, and to remove a clitoris. So it was very much still in its infancy. This brings us to John Money. John Money, who is also unfortunately from New Zealand, was a pediatric clinical psychologist in the new, as they called it, psychohormonal research unit, also at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And he analyzed all these sex assignments and reassignments in an attempt to learn the source of gender identity. John Money believed that gender was learnt rather than innate. And when a botched circumcision left an 8-month-old baby without a penis, Money convinced the baby's parents that sex reassignment surgery was their best and only option. The baby, David Reimer, was reassigned female, given hormone treatment, and raised as a girl. For years, Money reported on Reimer's case as a successful example of female gender development and, of course, of his own ideas. Reimer's parents had been lying about the success, however, and Reimer ended up identifying as male and eventually committed suicide over the psychological agony that the experiment caused him. Money, however, despite knowing and learning of this, continued to misrepresent the case as a stunning success. And his thesis that gender identity was entirely learned and sex was a social construct changed the standard procedure for an intersex baby from being the determination of the baby's real sex via the gonads to determining what sex should be assigned. And the sex that surgeons usually defaulted to was female, because, as an expression back then went, it's easier to dig a hole than build a pole. And now, thanks to John Money's unproven theories, starting in the 1960s, many doctors defaulted to advising early irreversible surgery on intersex children. These operations included clitoral reduction surgeries, which reduce the size of the clitoris for cosmetic reasons. This surgery can cause lasting pain, nerve damage, and scarring. Other operations include gonadectomies, the removal of the gonads, which result in the child being forced onto lifelong hormone replacement therapy. The history of surgery was also a history of shame and stigmatization. Secrecy was encouraged, with doctors instructing parents to conceal the diagnosis and treatment from the child, instilling feelings of shame in parents and children both. Sometimes, parents weren't even told about the surgeries performed, and instead had their baby taken away from them under the pretext of running some tests or other excuses, only to have their baby shipped off for surgery and returned a couple of days later with the parents none the wiser. Many intersex people didn't even learn about their conditions until they accessed their medical files as adults, sometimes as late as in their 50s. And that brings us to part 3, intersex issues today. Intersex people across the world are still subjected to medical practices that can inflict irreversible physical and psychological harm. These procedures are done with the stated aim of making it easier for children to grow up normal and integrate more easily into society by normalizing their appearance and helping them conform to their assigned sex. The supposed benefits of such interventions are very largely unproven, with a lack of evidence in their favor, and for most, there are no serious health considerations at stake either. Essentially, these are medically unnecessary cosmetic surgeries that could be delayed until intersex children are old enough to make the decision for themselves, rather than being done to infants who then have to live with the consequences for a lifetime. According to a German study conducted between 2005 and 2007, 81% of participants had been subjected to surgeries due to their intersex diagnoses. Almost half of participants reported psychological problems. 2/3 of adult participants reported sexual problems connected to their history of surgical treatment. And children reported significant disturbances in family life and physical well-being, areas that the medical and surgical treatment was supposed to stabilize in the first place. Another issue with surgery is that a significant number of intersex people end up not identifying with the sex assigned to them. To use my condition, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH as I'm going to call it again for brevity, 46 XX persons with CAH display both physical and behavioral masculinization, and although most develop a female gender identity, the rates of gender dysphoria are very many times higher than in the general population. The rate of gender dysphoria among endosex females has been quoted to be around 0.002 to 0.003, but amongst XX CAH patients, it can be from between 6.3 to 27.2%, which is almost an entire third. Due to this high rate of male gender identity development, the ethics of a surgical female sex assignment are very questionable. Surgically assigning a patient female that has an almost 1 in 3 chance to not identify with that in the future just doesn't make sense, especially when it can be delayed to later in life when the patient can choose for themselves. An issue which is further compounded by the fact that, despite surgical intervention being routine, surgical outcomes remain uncertain, and the data on future quality of life is very inconclusive. This interview with a mother who elected genital surgery on her daughter with CAH in 2011 in New York is quite illustrative of the current state of things. She told Human Rights Watch the urologist explained to her that there were large controversies surrounding the operation, and that all surgeries carried risks. She had a large clitoris that was reduced, but I don't know what else was done, the mother said, explaining she and her husband consented to a set of surgeries she could not recall. For me and my husband, there was no question. It was a birth defect, and we would fix it. I would have a mole removed as well, she said. She said the surgeon told her that there were risks in not doing surgery, including UTIs, and that the potential complications the surgeons discussed focused on fertility and whether her menstruation would flow normally, but that there was no mention of other possible issues. If my daughter had a huge goiter on her face, I would have it surgically removed, the mother said. Well-meaning parents often consent to surgeries on their intersex children, believing it to be necessary for the child to live a normal life, just like the mother in this example. However, this is prescribing a surgical solution to a social problem. The problem is not intersex anatomy, but the way society treats people with that anatomy. In 2015, the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights published Human Rights and Intersex People, recognizing intersex people's right to bodily autonomy and to not undergo unconsensual surgeries. The United Nations Office for Human Rights called upon UN countries to protect intersex people from discrimination and to ban medically unnecessary surgical interventions. It also recognized Australia and Malta as the first countries to explicitly prohibit discrimination against intersex people. Australia did so in 2013 and Malta in 2015. Also in 2015, Malta became the first country to outlaw non-consensual surgical intervention on intersex infants and children. Importantly, in Sweden, intersex people still have no explicit legal protection against discrimination nor the right to physical integrity and bodily autonomy via laws against unnecessary medical interventions. Here we have a map on the legal protections of intersex people throughout the world, with the countries in dark blue representing protection on grounds of sex characteristics, the medium blue on grounds of intersex status, and the light blue on grounds of intersex within an attribute of sex. Now, there has been a lot of progress made. Just 10 years ago, this map was completely grey. But as you can see, most of it still is. Progress has been made, but there's still a lot more left to go. According to the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, the LGBTI survey report they did in 2019, a long way to go for LGBTI equality. 62% of intersex respondents reported that they felt discriminated against in at least one area of life because of being intersex in the past year before the survey was taken, with 36% reporting feeling discriminated against at school or university, 35% in healthcare or social services, 33% in a bar, restaurant, cafe, or nightclub, 32% at work, 28% in shops, 27% looking for work, 25% showing identification documents, and 20% in housing. According to the same survey, 22% of intersex respondents experienced a physical and/or sexual attack for being LGBTI in the past 5 years, being the most affected amongst LGBTI people. 38% of intersex people at least once experienced violent in-person threats due to being LGBTI in the past year, with 27% even 6 or more times. 42% of intersex people experienced harassment for being LGBTI in the past year, with 41% of intersex people reported often or always avoiding certain locations, which was, again, the highest rate amongst respondents. 28% of intersex people experienced receiving offensive or threatening emails or text messages 6 or more times in the past year. Within Sweden, in June of this year, the Diskrimineringsombudsmannen published a report, Livsvillkor för personer med intersexvariation, or, without my terrible Swedish pronunciation, living conditions for people with intersex variations, with a focus on discrimination. And they concluded 3 main things. 1, that intersex people experience vulnerability in healthcare in the form of lack of treatment, harassment, lack of equal care, and lack of access to information. Secondly, that intersex people also face discrimination within education and in the workplace. And thirdly, that knowledge about sex variations needs to increase and research needs to be strengthened around discrimination of people with intersex variations. The same report by the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights I mentioned earlier, 2015, stated that intersex people's right to life can be violated in discriminatory sex selection and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, other forms of testing, and selection for particular characteristics. Such deselection or selective abortions are incompatible with ethics and human rights standards due to the discrimination perpetrated against intersex people on the basis of their sex characteristics. To use my condition again as an example, CAH, newborn screening programs for CAH are in place in many countries, and it is now becoming increasingly common to look for it via prenatal testing as well. Historically, prenatal genetic diagnosis via amniocentesis or chorionic villus sampling was used to identify if a fetus was affected. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis refers to the genetic testing of embryos prior to implantation as a form of embryo profiling, and sometimes even of oocytes prior to fertilization. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is considered in a similar fashion to prenatal diagnosis. And when used to screen for a specific genetic condition, it makes it highly likely that the baby will be free of the condition under consideration. However, these invasive methods increase the risk of miscarriage and infection. But within recent years, however, it has become increasingly possible to diagnose CAH through cell-free DNA testing, which is both non-invasive and the results can be available within hours, and the diagnosis can be made as early as 6 weeks. Non-invasive prenatal testing has been implemented into public healthcare systems as either a first-line test or a supplement to existing prenatal screening programs. In some countries, such as Belgium, over 75% of pregnant women undergo non-invasive prenatal testing to screen against diseases and other undesirable traits, such as CAH and other intersex conditions. Using non-invasive prenatal testing and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to select against infants with CAH and other intersex conditions is, however, quite clearly morally and ethically questionable, especially seeing as individuals with CAH are able to live normal and healthy lives. Terminating pregnancies and effectively removing the group from the population over what, in most cases, results in a mere cosmetic difference is all rather reminiscent of past eugenics policies and can be argued to be a form of sex eugenics. This is a serious problem facing intersex people today and in the future. As a society, we need to learn to be more accepting of differences rather than simply trying to remove people with them from the population, something which has never worked out in the past and never will. In short, although much progress has been made, there is still a long way to go for intersex rights. Thank you very much for listening to my lecture. You can reach me at my email here, Naftali.Ben Tziyon @oiisverige.se. And you also feel free to check out our website, oiisverige.se. Thank you very much.
I'm thinking for questions because I haven't received anyone in the chat function, but they can probably reach you after the lecture if they have any questions.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.